What's up, guys? Vylocity here with Pitchfork Academy, and I'm back with another Unreal Engine 5 material tutorial. In today's tutorial, we'll be looking at how to create an advanced Megascans master material that is an awesome solution to add variation to the ground in your project, or also any sort of wall mesh that you have. In this tutorial, you'll be learning how to create variation on top of a base material. So for example, we have this rock material and then blending on top is the moss. Now, the rock material could be cobblestone, it could be really any sort of base ground material, it could be a forest floor, and then on top of it, we have the moss, which could always be dirt or snow, anything that would accumulate on top of your base material. And then also you can see that we have the puddles that also fall in beneath the cracks of our material. And sometimes it goes on top of where there's moss, sometimes it doesn't. It really helps add some realistic variation. And as a bonus, I'll be showing how to enable nanite displacement, which actually helps raise the texture itself up off of the plane to create some realistic variation in the height. Alright guys, once we're in the project, the first thing that we need to do to enable the nanite displacement so we get the nice raising of the surface is to enable nanite tessellation. Now to do that, unfortunately, it is not as simple as a checkbox in the project settings. We actually need to go into our default engine file, and to do that, it's really simple. Just make sure you're right-clicking on Content, and then go to Show in Explorer, then go up one level so you see your Unreal Engine project and the config and content, all these folders here, and then go into the config folder and then double click on default engine. This will bring up a long list of commands that basically are the settings for your project. Now, it's really simple. All we need to do is copy and paste these two lines into where it says script engine renderer settings. Just paste them right here at the bottom. I'll leave them in the description so you can simply just copy and paste them here, and then make sure you file and save. I've already done this, so I'm not going to do it again, but once you click file and save, once these are in here, just exit out of this and then restart your project. Once you've restarted your project from enabling the Nanite Tessellation settings in the default engine file, we now need to go into the Megascans library. So to get to that, we need to go to the Quixel bridge. And to get there, we just click this cube with the plus and go down to Quixel Bridge. Once you click this, it will prompt you probably to sign in if you're not already. So just sign in with your Epic ID or create one, and then you should be good to go. Once we're inside Quixel Bridge, we need to search for a few textures to use for our master material. And to do that, we can just search at the top. I'm going to search for a few that I know that work well with the material. However, I strongly encourage you to kind of browse around and look for some cool textures that work for your project. With that being said, I'll search for Roman stone and scroll down until you find Roman stone floor. This one right here. So you can see this has some really nice rocks that are raised up, and this is kind of good because we'll be able to see the moss fall in the cracks and also go on top of the rocks in some areas. So once you download it, add it to your project, and it should direct you right back to your project and show you your Megascans folder and kind of where it went. You can see mine right here, and it should look like this. Next, we can go back to Quixel Bridge. I'll remove these searches at the top, and now I'll search for mossy forest floor. There's a ton of different moss textures. It really doesn't matter which one you get as long as it looks mostly like moss. I don't recommend getting textures that look like it's a combination of two materials. For example, this looks like a combination of rock and moss, which is kind of what we're going to be creating today. The problem with Megascans textures like this is once you see it over a large distance, it starts to get really repetitive. As you can see, the moss always falls in the same spot. So that's what we're going to be fixing today is we'll get moss that falls sometimes in the crevices, but also sometimes on the top of the rock. So the moss texture that we'll be using today is going to be mossy forest floor, and it looks like this. So once you download that, click add to your project. And the last texture that we'll get will be the ancient temple wall. And we'll use this one right here. Now, of course, you can use any of these. They will all work just fine. I like this one because there's some really nice detail with these three pillars and the intricate detail on the sides. So once you download that, click add to your project. and all three of those should be back in your services folder. The next thing that we need to do in order to have the nanite displacement work correctly is to create a plane mesh from scratch that has more triangles than the default plane in the engine. So to do that, we need to go from selection mode down to modeling mode, and then click on rectangle, and then make sure on the width, depth, it's 1000, and then the width subdivision and depth subdivision on 100. This will give us a large amount of triangles to work with because we're going to enable Nanite to get this to work. So once you have these set, it'll basically allow you to click in the world and you'll be able to see your mesh, and then just click accept. Now it'll place it in this folder called generated. As you see here, the chain it's in content, third person, maps, generated inside your folder, and then it'll be in here. Now it'll name it some arbitrary name. Just click on the one that you just made and then click F2 on your keyboard, or you can right click and click rename. And then let's name it SM underscore plane underscore nanite. Now we can double click on this and then it'll open up the mesh. And all we need to do in here is to enable nanite support. So I'll click that, apply. Now this is a nanite mesh and it's good to use with the material that we're going to create now. So we can save this, exit out, and switch it back from modeling mode to selection mode. And then let's make this the new floor. So I'll delete the floor that's currently there, and then I'll click on our plane. If you don't have it in the level, just drag it out. And then once you have the plane selected, make sure it's 0 on the Z value, and then basically you just want to position it in the middle of your level and then scale it to be a little bit bigger than the level so we can see how it extends out with the texturing. All right, once we have that, we're good to start working on the material. Once we're in our content folder, we can create a new folder called materials. If you don't already have one, just right click, new folder, and name it materials. I've already done that, so I'll double click there, and then I'll right click in the materials folder and create another new folder called surfaces. And then I'll double click on that. And then inside here, I'll right click and create material. This will be called M underscore surface. And then I'll double click that to open it up. And then I'll make it full screen. All right, the first thing that we need to do inside of our material is over on the left in the details panel, we need to select this use material attributes. So what this will do is basically it'll collapse this down to a single node called material attributes, and it allows us to blend multiple of those material boxes together. So to get one of those back, we need to right click and search for make material attributes. And as you can see, this looks just like the box that we transformed from this. So now I'll just copy and paste this. Now we have two. And basically to blend these together, we need to search for a blend material attributes. And right away you can see that it's asking for two inputs and an alpha. So the alpha will be how we blend these two together. So this will be our base material, for example, the rock or the wall. And then this will be the coverage material, which could be snow or moss. In this case, we'll be doing moss. And it's important to plug this top one into the B and then the bottom one into the A. I like to have the base material up top, so I know that this is kind of the first one and the most important one. And then this is the moss coverage. And I just happen to know that we do need it to be flipped like this. So now we can plug this into here. And basically now just to show what's going on, I can hold 3 and get a color. I just want to showcase really quick what's happening. So if I plug this into base color, copy and paste this over here into coverage, and I'll make this a totally different color. You don't have to follow along here. I just want to showcase kind of what's happening with this. If I get a texture and search maybe for grid. Great. Plug this into here. Now if I save, you can see right away that it's mixing these two together. Now if I save and put this on the material, you can see right away that basically we have these two different materials that are being blended by this alpha. And the alpha in this case is this grid texture. We're going to do something much more advanced with this, and it'll kind of use the crevices of our base material to blend the secondary material on top of. All right, so now we can go back into our material, and I'll just delete the stuff that I added for demonstration, and we can begin adding the nodes that we'll need to create this material. Once we have the material set up just like this, we need to create some texture variation nodes that we'll use for helping our materials blend a little bit better and be more varied. So to do that, we'll right click up here at the top for texture object. And off of here, we'll search for world aligned texture. This will use triplanar projection to project the texture on every axis of our mesh, so we don't have to worry about the orientation of the object, and it will just always apply the variation correctly. From here, we can get a scalar parameter and call this macro noise scale. This will become our texture size. And now on our texture object, we need to search for wind. And we need this game wind noise. It should be in your engine project. And right away, you can see it's this colorful texture. And if you click on the RGB at the top and you only have one selected, you can see that basically it's different versions of the noise that have sort of different patterns. So this will help us have variation that's in different spots and it won't be so repetitive. Now, to get those separate different channels, we need to split the components. So now we have that RGB. So for example, this is the R, this is the G, this is the B. And now off of this, we can search for add named reroute declaration. And this will be called macro noise 1. Now I'll copy and paste this 2 more times. G and B. Now I'll rename this macro noise 2 and macro noise 3. Now we can go ahead and copy all these nodes here. And we'll rename this from macro noise to micro noise scale. And off of R, we'll search for add named reroute declaration node. And this will be micro noise 1. Copy and paste this twice. And this will be, I'll do that one 3, and then this one will be 2. Whoops. And then we plug these into there. All right. So now this is our noise variation that we'll use for helping create more variation in our material. So I'll select all this, click C, and this will be noise variation. And before we go further, I do want to create a group for these 2 parameters, and I'll just select them both. And on the left in group, I'll call this noise. So you can see now if I click only on the macro noise, it's group noise, and micro is in noise as well. All right, now we can go down to our first material, which will be the base material. And to start, we need to get those textures that we got from Megascans. So let's go back to our project and go into your surfaces folder and find Roman stone floor that we downloaded. And I just hold Control and click each one of these so they're all selected. And then I'll drag them into my material here and then into the graph. Now we can have this one up here and this one here and this one here. You want to have a little bit of space between them so we can add nodes and it's not too crowded. So first we need to get the UV information, which will be plugged into each of these UVs because they're all from the same texture set. To start, we need to get a XY world position node. This will project the texture in world position, so no matter what object you put it in, it will be the same scale. And we'll create a parameter called base scale. This will go into here, and the default will be 1000. And then I'll select this and create a group called base. Whoops. And then off of this, we want to get a switch, static switch parameter, and we'll call this use world space UVs, question mark. And we'll have it true by default. So by default, it will use the 1000 world position scale, And then if it's false, it will actually use the texture coordinate. This will be good if you have a mesh that you want to use this for that has been UV'd correctly and it needs to follow those UVs. You'll use this, and you can drag off and search for multiply. And we'll make another parameter called base scale UV. And this will also go into the base group. Whoops. And we'll plug this into multiply. And the base scale UV default value will be 1. So we have 1,000 for this base scale and 1 for the base scale UV. And this will go into false. And this will be the UVs for each of our textures. The last thing we need to do with the UVs is just to select the world space UV switch. And we'll make a group called dash switches. The reason I'm putting a dash is so that it puts it at the top of the material instance list. So it'll always be at the top when you create a material instance, and you'll see it right away. And you'll know like which texture scaling method that it's using. And next we need to create these texture samples. We need to put these into parameters. So I'll right click, convert to parameter, and this will be called base albedo. This one will be base ORD. O is for ambient occlusion, R is for roughness, and D is for displacement or the height. And the normal map will be called base normal. Now we want to select all of these and put them in the base group because they're for the base material. And we're good to start working on the base albedo next. All right, off of RGB, we can search for blend overlay. This is a common way to blend color texture. It's commonly used in Photoshop. So what we'll do is hold 3 on our keyboard and click for a color. I'll right click, convert to parameter, call it base color. And I'll duplicate this, and this will be called base color variation. And both of these will go into the group for base. And by default, the color should be middle gray, which is 0.5. The blend overlay node requires the colors to be middle gray. Now we need to morph these together or lerp between them. So I'll hold L and click for a lerp. And this color will be the A, and this one will be the B. And the alpha will be one of these noises. It doesn't really matter what, but since we've just started using them, I'll right click and search for macro noise 1. And this will be the alpha. So it'll use the R channel of this texture to basically color where it's lighter to be one color and where it's darker to be the other. That'll create some nice color variation on top of our base albedo texture. So now we can plug this into blend, and then this goes into base color. Now we can go down to our base ORD texture, and the R is for ambient occlusion. It just goes straight in. And the G is for roughness. So we'll drag off of this, search for multiply, and then we'll make a parameter called base roughness. And this will be of default value of 1, and it'll be in the group base. Plug that into there, and this goes into roughness. Drag this over here. B will actually go into a cheap contrast node, and this will be a parameter called base height contrast. By default, let's set this to 2. This will make the it'll make the default value for the displacement more contrasted, so we get more defined edges where the moss can kind of go in and on top of this texture. And then we'll set this in the group base. And now we need to do another one of those add named reroute declaration nodes because we'll use this in other parts of the graph, but this helps us clean it up so we don't have to have lines going everywhere in our material. So off of this, we'll name it base height. Whoops. And then this goes into displacement. Remember, displacement is the setting that we enabled at the beginning in the default engine files. It allows us to actually use this input for our materials as long as our mesh has Nanite enabled, which we did on our plane earlier. All right, next we can do the normal map information. So off of RGB, search for flatten normal, and the flatness will be our intensity values. So I'll hold S and click for a parameter, and this will be base normal intensity. I did not spell that right. All right. Default value will be 2. It's a little bit stronger than the default. So first we need to drag off and search for 1 minus and plug this in. This flips it so it's not flatness. It changes it from flatness to intensity. Then we need another named reroute declaration node. So I'll add named reroute, and this will be base normal. And off of this, we'll just plug it right into normal. And this base normal intensity needs to be in the group base. All right, so everything here should be in the base group on the left. Looks good. And we're good to move on to the next material, which is the coverage material. So for the coverage material, we do need to go back to our content folder and go to surfaces and find the mossy forest floor that we downloaded from Megascans. And we'll select all of these textures and just drag them into our graph here and kind of space them out. Oh, this one needs to be at the bottom, this one here. All right, so it will be similar to this setup up here, but there will be a few differences. This will all be the same, so we can actually copy and paste it, but we will need to rename the parameters and put them into different groups. So instead of base scale, it'll be coverage scale, and I'll copy that coverage so I can paste it into here. And then I'll select both of these nodes and I'll make a new group called coverage. So now when I select coverage, or coverage scale, you can see it's in coverage, and this one is as well. And this one should still be in switches because it's an overall setting that we'll set for the material. And then now we can create the parameters for these. So I'll right click, convert to parameter. I'll paste coverage and call it albedo. Convert to parameter, paste coverage, ORD, right click parameter, coverage, normal. And then I'll select all of these, and over on the left, I'll set the group to be coverage. All right, so now we're good to work on the albedo information for the coverage. So off of RGB, I'll search for blend overlay, and then I'll hold 3 and click for a color. I'll right click, convert to parameter, and we'll call this coverage color. This will be in the group coverage, and the default value will be 0.5 on the V to make it middle gray. Now, I want to do something to make, for example, if it's moss, a little bit brighter on the edges if it's viewed at an angle to give it that moss feel. So off of result, we can search for lerp, and it'll be called linear interpolate. You can also just hold L and click to get one. And then the alpha will be the Fresnel. So I'll right click, search for Fresnel, Fresnel. And then I'll hold S and click for a parameter. This will be called moss edge Fresnel. Let's set the default value to 5 and we'll plug this in. And this will be our alpha. And then we need to hold M and click for a multiply. And we'll get another parameter called moss edge brightness. Default value will be 1, and we'll plug this into the B. And then the blend overlay, which is the same albedo, will be plugged into the A. And then this will be going to B. So basically, by default, the moss will be the same because we're multiplying it by 1, which will just be itself. But if we increase this value in our material instance, on the edge, it will become brighter. But on the center of the material, if you're looking at it straight on, it will just be the same color that is set back here. So we can just plug this now into base color. Put this up here a bit. And then I'll set both of these parameters to be in the coverage. Now we can work on the ORD texture. The R will go straight into ambient occlusion. The G will drag off and search for multiply, and we'll get a parameter called that coverage roughness. Default value for this should be 1, so it's the same as the texture from Megascans. And then we'll set the coverage roughness in the group coverage, and this will go into roughness. Drag that over here. And then the B is the displacement, and this will just go straight into displacement. We don't need to add any logic there. All right, so for the normal map, we're going to do a couple of things. So we'll flatten the normal, and we'll get a parameter called coverage. I could just paste that in, normal intensity. Default value will just be 1, and then we'll 1 minus that and plug it into flatness. Now, the next thing that we'll do seems a little bit confusing, but just bear with me, and then I'll show an example when we finish the material of kind of how this works. But basically, we want to, wherever this coverage material lies on top of the base material, we want to have a little bit of this base normal map show through. So it's not just this moss texture. That way, for example, if the moss is on top of a bunch of bricks, we still see a little bit of the brick normal map from below. So to do that, we'll get another lerp. So hold L and click. And this will be the B. And remember, we saved the normal map information from our base material up here to use in other spots. So if I just right click and search for base normal, it's right there at the top, and this will be our A. And then we just need a single value to control which one shows through a little bit more. So to do that, we'll hold S and click, and this will be called base normal influence. And this default value will be 0.75. This means that it will mostly use the normal map from the moss, but it will let a little bit of the base normal through. For example, if I had this at 0.5, it would use half and half, but I think a value of 0.75 is good, and then you can adjust this based on your preference later. And this base normal influence and coverage normal intensity will both go into the coverage group. Oh, we do need to do one thing. So off of base normal influence, we need to saturate this. This will keep it from going above 1 or below 0. All right, we're good to plug this into normal. Now that we have our materials created inside here, we can select all of the base material stuff, and we'll click C, name it base material, like so, and then same for the coverage. I'll select everything here and call this coverage material. All right. Now I'll actually drag this stuff down here. I'll kind of align this node with this one because we need to put a bunch of stuff here for this alpha blend here to decide how we're going to blend the base material with the coverage material. The logic that we're about to add now is going to allow us to blend the materials together based on the height map of the base material. For example, in this B channel of the Roman stone floor ORD, you can see that it's darker in the crevices and lighter on top. So now we're going to use that information to blend the moss on top of it. So to start, we need to grab one of our macro noises. We'll get the macro noise 2 since we already used macro noise 1. This will keep the variation going strong. And then off of this, search for subtract. And then we need a parameter called height 1 bias. Height 1 bias. Plug that into there. And the default value will be -0.5. It's very important that you follow along with these values and then you can tweak them later, but just trust me for now, and this should look pretty good once we get it into the level. Off of subtract, search for multiply. And this will be called height 1 contrast. So just select bias there, contrast, and then this default value will be 0.5, so a positive 0.5. Then off of this, we need to saturate to clamp it between 0 and 1 so we don't get extreme values and odd results. And then now we need to search for a height lerp node. This is a very powerful node and allows us to use that texture to blend between the two materials. So off of this will go into our transition phase. This is where the blending will start to happen. So we're going to use that noise to decide where the blend starts to happen. And now we need to do the height texture information. So we'll right click and search for base height. And then we need to get a lerp node. The base height goes into this. And then we need to drag off also of base height, search for a 1 minus, and plug this into B. So this will flip the height map based on what we say right here. So to do that, we'll get the micro noise 1. Off of this, search for subtract. And then we'll get a parameter called height 2 bias. The default value for this will be 0.25. From subtract, search for multiply. And we'll get another parameter called height 2 contrast. Default value for this will actually be 5. Plug that into B, and we'll saturate that. This will be the alpha of that. And we need one more lerp. This will just add a little bit more variation. So I'll plug this into the A, and then I'll 1 minus this. So we're flipping all of this that we just made, plugging that into B. And then now let's get the macro noise 3. And we'll plug this into a cheap contrast node with just a default value of 1. So if you hold 1 on your keyboard and click, you'll just get a constant value. It's not a parameter. And we just want this to always be 1. So it'll be a contrast of 1. And then this will be the alpha. Now we still need to plug this into height texture. And we'll create one more parameter. And we'll call this height contrast overall. It's the overall contrast of the height blend. And default value will be 0.5. A little bit of contrast. Now we still need to create a group for all of this stuff. So I'll just select all of these. And over on the left, we'll call this height. And I'll put these two down here also into height. So we should have these 3 and these 2 all in the group height. Remember, the default values are negative 0.5 for this one, 0.5, 0.5. Down here we got 0.25 and 5. All right, now we can select all of this and click C, and we'll call this the height mask. And then this alpha will be the alpha for our blend material attributes. All right, once we have this set up, the last thing we need to do that I forgot is set the default macro noise scale to 5,000, and we'll set the micro noise scale to 4,000, just a little bit smaller, so they don't line up when we scale them. Now if we click save and go back to our content folder, let's right click on M surface, create material instance, and we'll call this mi_ground. Because we're making the surface of the ground. So now when I drag this on here, right away you can see that we have moss that sort of can fall on top of the rocks and also in the crevices, and it's pretty broken up nicely, and we don't see too much of repetition in the moss placement. Now if we zoom up to the wall, we'll notice that there is no height variation in the texture. It's still just a flat plane. We don't have that nanite displacement just yet. So to enable that, we still need to go into our material, and then on the left in the details panel, find enable tessellation. Scroll down from top here, and it's right there. So we'll click that, and then we'll save. Might take a second. And we do need to set this to 0 on the center. All right, so now if we go over here, we can see that this rock actually is lifted up off the ground and we get that nice displacement effect. It's more obvious if I go over to this ramp. You can see that the rock kind of is protruding up over this ramp. Now, if you want to increase the size of the displacement, you can just go back to your material. And for example, if I double this from 4 to 8 and save, now when we go back, it's much more displaced. And if I play with my character, you can see that the texture is actually coming up over my feet, which is probably not ideal. So it's kind of a value that you need to play with, because tessellation does not change the collision of the ground at all. It just changes the actual geometry and brings it up a little bit. So I'll set that back to 4. I think it's a decent value, and then I'll save. Now, if we go into our material instance and enable all of these parameter switches to adjust, we can start to play with the look of our material and get some different results. A couple more. All right, so I'll drag this over here on the side so we can see what we're doing while we mess with it. So if I zoom out and go all the way down to noise, right here we have macro noise scale, and you can see as I increase this, it sort of changes the location of how the moss is blending. If I make it really big, you can see it's really hard to tell the variation location, but if I make it really small, you can see it starts to be a little bit repetitive. So I like to keep it around 5,000 for that one. Whoops. And then the micro noise scale is just helping break that texture repetition up a little bit. So I'll keep that at 4,000. Now I do want to change the moss logic here. So if I go down to an area where the moss is at and I increase the moss edge brightness to, for example, 4, you can see it's instantly brighter if I'm viewing it at an angle. But if I look down, it's the same. So if I go straight up and I mess with this value, you don't really see the change because it's based on the angle. So I think a value of 2 or 3 is good. I'll keep it on 3. And the moss edge Fresnel is just how much of an angle that you need to be looking at it at. So if I set it to 1, you can see it got brighter right at the surface, but as I increase it, it becomes darker and you have to really be at an angle to see the increased value. So I'll keep it at 5 and 3 for the brightness. Now the next parameter that I want to showcase is stuff for the height. So if we go down to the height section and I change the height bias, if I lower it, you can see the moss sort of disappears. And once it's all the way gone, it's really easy to see how repetitious this texture is. But as I bring the moss back, it really helps to break up the repetition and make it look a little bit more realistic. So I like a value of 0.5. Now, if you really want the moss to cover your surface, you can increase it more, and you can see it's just barely letting through some of the rocks. So I'll keep it at negative 0.5. The height 1 contrast just tightens that up a little bit, but as you increase this, you will have to mess with this value more. So it's really just playing around with these settings, finding what you like best and what works for your project. And the height 2 bias, I really wouldn't mess with too much. It's just kind of where the height map flips and allows the moss to fall in the cracks versus on top of the rocks. So again, I like keeping it at 0.25. And this height 2 contrast kind of tightens that up a little bit. As you can see here, if I put it to the left, it's real soft. Up to the right, the transition is a little bit more. So I like to keep it at a value of 5. And the height contrast overall is just going to make everything more contrasted. So you can see as I increase that, it's very obvious where the line is for where the texture blends with the other one. So I'll keep that at 0.5. Now let's look at how to add puddles into our material and add even more variation to what we already have here. So let's go back into our material and look at our graph. So far we've blended 2 material attributes together with this blend material attributes node, and the alpha is our height and noise information to add all of the variation that you saw that we already have. And now you can see here, this goes straight into the material attributes. But what we want to do now is add the puddles in between here. So that way the puddles blend both on top of the base and the coverage material. It's sort of a global change to what we have before this node here. So now we need to drag off of blend material attributes and search break material attributes. Once we have this, we can also search for make material attributes. So you'll notice that this is the same as we have over here. And now basically we have to think about, what does a puddle actually do to a surface, or what happens when something becomes more wet? So the color becomes darker, so we'll need to do something for the base color. It also becomes shinier, so we'll have to do something with the roughness. And it also becomes flatter looking, so we'll have to do something with the normal. And lastly, the displacement will also have to change. Wherever the water is, we'll have to flatten that as well. So to start, let's plug everything in that we don't need to change. So we don't need to change the specular, we don't need to change the metallic, we don't need to change anything with the emissive, we don't need to change anything with the ambient occlusion. So we just need to change stuff with the base color, roughness, normal, and displacement. So first we need to create the mask of how the puddles actually work. So to do that, we need to search for our micro noise 2. We haven't used this one yet. And then off of this, search for subtract. We're doing the same method where we have a bias and contrast. So I'll get a parameter and call this puddle noise bias. Default value for this will be 0. So we'll leave that as is. And then off of subtract, we'll get a multiply. And I'll copy this node and I'll just rename this to contrast. Puddle noise contrast. This value will be a default of 1. And while we're here, I'll just select both of these and make a new group called puddle height. So I'll select these, puddle height. Now we need another height lerp node because we want the puddles to fall in the cracks and the crevices of our material that we already have. So after this, we need to saturate, and then we can finally plug it into transition phase. All right. So now our height texture will be macro noise 2. So we have micro noise 2 at the top, macro noise 2 down here. So off of this, we'll subtract. So the parameter that goes into here will be called puddle height, bias. This default value will be 0.25. That goes into B. Off of this, we'll search for multiply. And I'll copy this node here. Puddle height contrast for this one. And default value of 1. And then this will go into the puddle height group here. So all 4 of these are in puddle height, because this is all the information that we'll use to control kind of where the puddles are laying on the material and the height of them. So if it's, for example, really low puddles or really high puddles and covering the entire surface. The last thing we need to do is actually add this. So we'll get an add node, and we'll add this to the base height. Remember, this base height, if you double click on any of these, it'll take you to where you're setting it. Remember, this is the base height of our base material, which in this case is our Roman stone floor. So if I go to the B channel, it'll use some of this information for the puddles as well. So the puddles will fall into these cracks, but also we're going to add the noise, which will basically allow more variation, and we'll have areas that are totally sunken down into the ground and some that are raised up, which will really help the variation overall. All right, so back down here by our puddle height information. So after this add, we can plug it straight into height texture, and then we'll create one more parameter for this called puddle height, or sorry, it'll be called puddle contrast overall with the default value of 0.5. And this will also go into the group puddle height. All right, so off of the alpha, we can add named reroute declaration. And this is our puddle mask. Puddle mask. Now select all of this, click C, and call this puddle mask. I'll actually drag this down here because we need to add some information here for our puddles. So for the rippling effect, so it actually looks like the wind is moving the water a little bit. So to do that, we'll right click for a texture sample parameter 2D, and we'll name this puddle ripple normal. And then we want to search over on the left for water. And we'll use this water normal 01 underscore n. And then we can actually copy and paste this because we'll have two of them. And over on the left, we need to create a parameter called puddle ripple scale. Default value for this will be 1000, and it will go into an XY world position node. And then off of this, we'll search for panner. We're going to pan the UVs in a certain direction to make it look like our water is moving. This goes into UVs here. And now we need to get a append node. So if I right click and search for append vector, and we can hold S and click for another scalar, and we'll call this ripple speed, but not with 3 P's. We'll do 1 less P, ripple speed. And this will be a value of 0.0075, so a really small value, 0.0075. And this will go into A and B together. This goes into speed, and then we need to add another panner node, so I'll just copy and paste this. This will go into this UV. Now, to make sure that we have not as much repetition, I'll drag off of this world position XY node. So this is the same scale that we're plugging into this one, but I do want to multiply it by a small number of 1.25. This will make it 1.25 times bigger. So this will become the coordinate for there. And then it'll go in the same speed here, but first we want to multiply it by -1. And then plug this into speed. So basically what we're saying is the same speed that we're using for this texture, we're multiplying it by -1, which will flip it. So this texture will be panning in the opposite direction as this one. So it'll look like the water is moving in opposite directions, which will give the effect that the water is moving in the wind. All right, now we need to blend these together. So I'll search for blend, angle corrected normals, and this will be the base. This will be the additional. And then off of this, we'll search for flatten normal, and we'll get a parameter called ripple intensity. And the default value for this will be 0.05. We don't want the ripples to be too harsh because it is just a puddle after all, and it's not an ocean. So we'll lower the intensity quite a bit. And that's good for that. Let's create a group for this stuff. So if I select ripple, we'll call it puddle ripples. So puddle ripples. And these two will also go into that puddle ripples, and these two textures also. All right, so now we can select everything for the ripples. We'll click C, and we'll call it puddle ripples. And we won't do anything with this just yet. We're going to do a little bit more work up here, and then we'll eventually plug this into our normal information in blending right in here. So to start, we need to drag off of base color and search for blend overlay. And we'll hold 3 and click for a color. We'll right click, convert to parameter, puddle tint is fine. And we'll double click on this, set the V to 0.5 for the middle gray. Plug that into blend. And then we need to multiply because we want to multiply it by a lower number to make it look darker. So I'll hold S and click and name this puddle darkness. The default value for this will be 0.25. I'll plug this into B. And then let's make a new group called puddle. So the color so far and the puddle darkness are both in the group puddle. The reason I have 3 different groups for puddles is because there's a lot of information here and I don't want it to be too messy in our material instance. So I made another group for just the puddle stuff and just overall how it looks. And off of multiply, we need to search for a lerp or linear interpolate. And then, so this will be the A, and then the B will just be the same base color that we have for all of this information in our base material. And the alpha will be our puddle mask. I can just right click, search for that, and this will go right into there. And then this is our base color. And then we can actually copy and paste this lerp and puddle mask for our roughness. And the roughness goes for here, and then our roughness over here goes to B. And we just need a simple parameter for puddle roughness. Oops. And we'll by default have it be 0, so it's totally shiny. We could just have this as a constant value of 0, but in case you have a project where the liquid is not totally smooth, you can change that here and make it rougher if you like. You know, maybe for some sort of alien environment or whatnot, you can change how shiny the puddles are. All right, so now we can do the normal. So we can copy and paste the lerp and the puddle mask again. And the B is going to be the original normal, and then we can plug this into normal. And then the A is going to be our puddle ripples that we made down here. So the puddle mask will blend between the original normal map information, which is, you know, the textures that we made back here, with the puddle ripple normal maps down here. And then the last thing we need to do is for the displacement. So we can copy and paste the lerp and puddle mask one more time. And the displacement from the left will go into B. And we'll keep the A as 0. So no displacement where the puddles are. And then this goes straight into displacement. Now we can highlight all of these nodes here and click C, and we'll call this puddle adjustments. Everything to do with adjusting the look of the puddle, but not the ripples or the location that they appear. Now the last thing we need to do is plug this make material attributes into surface. That's very important. And one last thing I forgot to do is to drag off of ripple intensity and type 1-. This will make sure that it's actually the intensity value and not the flatness value. So it's flipping it. So now we can save one more time. And when we go back to our project, right away you can see that we have puddles. And if we zoom in, we can see that the puddles kind of fall in the cracks of the rocks, and sometimes on top of the moss, sometimes where there is no moss, and we get this really nice variation across the entire thing. And if we go back to our material instance, drag this over here, go back to our map, and if I go down to the puddle stuff, we can see puddle height bias. Now if I drag this to the left, the puddles disappear, and as I drag it to the right, it becomes more and more flooded. And if I drag it all the way, you can see that everything looks underneath and there's no displacement at all. But as I bring this back, you can see the displacement really coming in and has that really nice texture variation and height variation. Now we can hit play and we can run around. All right, one last thing that I forgot to do is I noticed this, I have this global scalar parameter values for puddle roughness. This means I didn't put it in the group. So if I scroll all the way down to the parent, I can double click that and we'll go back to our graph. And now I just got to find that parameter. So puddle roughness, you can see on the left it has a group none. We just got to set this in the puddle group. So now I can save and back to third person map. And if I go back to my material, everything should be in a nice and organized group. and we can change all sorts of stuff. So if I go to puddle tint, for example, I can change the color to something crazy like blue or maybe some red. But yeah, I like to keep it at the default value. Now you could set it to be a little bit more green, so it has the look as if the moss is kind of tinting the water more, which isn't too bad. I'll actually do that. I'll set that to there. I'll reset my puddle height bias. I can turn all these on. And if I go to a nice angle where we can see the ripples, so you can see they're moving. If I increase the speed, you can see it moves really fast. That's why I like that small value of 0.0075. And the ripple intensity just accentuates the normal map there, but it kind of looks too unrealistic, so that's why I like it nice and soft, like so. And yeah, that's the variation for the puddles and the moss. And if I just really quickly take the puddles away and the height away, you can see just how much variation and help that added. So if I Control Z, now it's really hard to tell that it is the same texture repeated over and over again. Now, if you look really hard, you will see the repetition. For example, this rock here is kind of, you can see it's repeated, but sometimes it has moss on it here, and sometimes the moss is there. Sometimes it has no moss. Sometimes it's a little bit underwater. So that's really why I like having the different noise textures that allow us to have tons of variation across the surface and kind of break up the texture. One of the other controls that we added is the base color and variation color. So base color, we can leave the same, and base color variation, this we can maybe make a little bit over here and drag it down some. Nice. Now we have some overall color variation where it gets darker in some areas and stays lighter in others. For example, if I go to the base color and increase this and change it to another color, you can kind of see what's happening. We have two areas where we can adjust the color. I like to leave the base color by default because I do like the color here in the default texture. But if you don't like this sort of brownish tint to the rock, you could maybe push it more into the bluish area, and it can kind of brighten things up a little bit, but I'll leave it at default. You can also change the base scale to help the texture repetition even more. So if I set it to 2500, you can see it's much harder to tell that it's a repeating texture. And if I go down to the ground and play, it's really hard to tell that it's the same Megascan texture repeated over and over again. And it almost looks like we placed these rocks in the scene because they do have a little bit of depth offset. Now, this isn't supposed to replace your level design. Like, you should still definitely place rocks on top of these to have even more of a detailed environment, but this definitely helps set the foundation of the level, which is always going to be the ground and the floor. The next thing I want to show is how to basically turn this material into one that can be used for a wall. So if I drag this to be 90 degrees, you can see there's a ton of problems. Not only is the texture stretching, but we have the puddles on the wall as well. So I'll Control Z so we have this as it was, and we'll go back into our master material. And at the very end here, we need to add another switch. So I'll right click and search for static switch parameter. And I'll call this isWall ? And if it's not a wall, we want to do everything that we were doing before. But if it is a wall, we only want to do everything before material, or sorry, before break material attributes, because we don't want the puddles on the wall. It doesn't really make sense. So we can just drag off of this and bring it all the way to true. Now I'll double click on this wire here to drag it up, and I'll double click again and drag this one over here so it's nice and clean and we can see what's happening. So if it is a wall, we're bypassing the puddle information and we're only using the base and the coverage material over here. And now we can select isWall and put it in the switches group. So now if I save and go back to my map and I create another material, so I'll right click on mi ground, duplicate, and I'll call this mi_wall. And then I'll actually just, I'll duplicate this material, or sorry, this mesh. So I'll hold Alt and drag, and then I'll rotate it So if you click E and rotate, you can do that. And now that it's straight up and down, drag it up. And we'll go into MI wall. And I'll drag MI wall onto this. And at first it will be not different at all, but we need to turn on these switches. So if it is a wall, it has no puddle, so I check that to be true. And we don't want to use world space UVs, so I'll click this. So now that it's not using world space UVs, it's using the actual UVs of the texture, or sorry, of the plane itself. So it's not stretching, and we get this nice projection here. And now we can actually go to our surfaces. So I'll go back to Megascans, surfaces, and I want to find the ancient temple wall. So now as soon as I start placing these in here, you can see now we have this temple wall, and I'll actually make it a little bit smaller. Whoops. And as you can see, it puts moss sometimes in the cracks over here, sometimes on the top of like these little pillars, but also sometimes in between. And it just adds some really nice sort of moss overgrowth variation to our material. And just to showcase that a little more, if I scroll all the way down to the macro noise scale and change the scale, you can see it changes where the texture is blending the moss on top of. So you can set these values to whatever. I like the 5,000 and 4,000 values. And if I click on this and I duplicate that again, and then I duplicate these and bring them up on top, you can see that the moss is in different places on different versions of the plane because the variation is projected in world space, and it doesn't matter if it's on the same mesh or not. We get different areas where the moss is. So for example, on these three pillars here, the moss is in between the second and the third, but over here it's not there, and it kind of goes on top of this third one and on top of the first and in the corner of the first. So that's how you get that really nice macro variation on your material, so you don't get that very repetitious look like this. So I'll Control Z back to that. All right, I want to show just a couple examples of different ways you can use this ground material. So I'll browse to where the plane is that we created, drag this into the level, and then on the Z coordinate, I'll set it to 0, and then it's right below me, and I'll set the scale to 2. And then I'll duplicate this 2 times. All right, I'll go back to my content folder, materials, surfaces, and I'll drag MI ground onto here, and then I'll duplicate this and call this MI ground forest floor. Or just forest is fine. Put that one there. I'll duplicate this again. MI stone. Put that one there. So for the forest, we're going to go to Megascans, surfaces, and I happen to already have a few texture sets for Megascans on here that I'm going to use for this. This is just to get you guys thinking about the different sort of things you can make with this material. So I'll get the ancient temple jungle roots. I'll drag these into their respective texture parameters, and then I'll go to the coverage, and I'll choose a different moss. So instead of a moss, I'll use this clover texture. And now we have these nice clover leaves sort of blending on top of the sticks here. And then for this one, for the ground stone, I'll find these temple stone tiles. Drag these into here. And then instead of moss, let's do something a little bit different. Let's get a dirt texture. So I think I have one dry riverbed. That's it. Drag this into here. And right away you can see that we have this sort of dirt texture blending on top of our stone. Sometimes it falls more in the cracks than others, and sometimes we get puddles. So it's some nice variation going across the whole surface. And Yeah, guys, this is just to show you some examples. For example, this could be the top of a building or the walkway near a castle. This could be, if you have a forest area. And this could be, in some old fantasy city where it's a bunch of stones and you have moss overgrowing and puddles. All right, I'll duplicate all three of these and drag them down. We'll make a few more examples. So I'll browse to my material section and I'll right click, duplicate MI ground. We'll call this one rock. And I'll open that one up. Browse to my Megascans. And I'll just find some sort of rock textures that I have. Let's see. This one should do. And instead of moss, let's try something different. I have this compost rose texture. Let's see how that looks. Not bad. And I can always change the color as well. So if I go to coverage color, increase that, maybe put a green tint or maybe a brown, we get this dirty looking material on top. Duplicate this one. Call this ground cobblestone. This one here. I'll reset that color so we don't have the same tint. And I'll go to my surfaces, and I know I already have a cobblestone texture set, so I'll drag these in here. This is just to show how easy it is once you have the material set up to create variation for different surfaces in your project. Let's try forest moss. Drag these into here. Awesome. And the last one, let's see what kind of surfaces I have here. All right, I have this Icelandic rock cave, so let's make one for that. I'll duplicate cobblestone. We'll just call it cave. Why not? Could be the floor of a cave or something like that. As you can see, by default, they line up with each other because we're using the world space texture scaling. So it always lines up, and it doesn't matter where your mesh is placed. As long as the mesh is there, the texture is projected onto it. So I'll put the cave one on here and then drag this texture set onto here. You can see right away, we get this really nice variation with the puddles and the moss. Let's try changing the coverage to something different. What if we do another cliff texture? Let's try that. Some different variation with a rock texture. It's not bad. But let's also see it with more moss. Let's do clover patches. Yeah. Awesome. And we have the rocks sort of coming out of the ground. The water is nice and flat. And kind of run through all of these. So here's the cobblestone. The rock. This is the original one that we made. And here's sort of the forest swampy one. And last but not least, the stone temple texture with the dirt on top. All right, guys, you've successfully created a really powerful master material that utilizes the free Megascan assets from Quixel Bridge, as well as the new Nanite displacement technology that allows the texture itself to add geometry to the mesh that you're standing on. And it allows for this really, really realistic look that can really help take your projects to the next level. And we also learned how to create the same material, but for a wall where we don't have the puddle effect, and it uses the correct texture scaling. So I really hope you guys learned something new. And if you found this tutorial valuable at all, or if you want to see more like it, please make sure to hit like and subscribe and comment down below if you have any suggestions or questions about materials. And that's going to do it for today. This is Velocity with Pitchfork Academy, and I hope to see you in the next one.